Hello everyone, welcome back to our channel US Immigration News. We hope you are doing great. Well, in today's video, we will be talking about the potential impact of Trump presidency on US immigration, what immigrants can expect.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. You're here because you're interested in what a second Trump presidency could mean for US immigration.
Right.
We found this recent article that lays out some potential changes, and it's a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
And just to be clear up front, this deep dive isn't about, taking sides or anything like that.
Yeah.
We're not here to tell you what to think about any of this. It's about, understanding what these potential shifts could be and how they might affect people.
Yes.
So we'll be looking at asylum work permits, family visas, and a whole lot more. So are you ready to dive in?
Absolutely, I am. And I think it's important to remember that the article doesn't just talk about like minor tweaks or adjustments, It really suggests a pretty big shift in the whole approach to immigration.
Right.
Like a real change in direction, especially when it comes to enforcement and restrictions.
Yeah, and right away the article talks about asylum. It predicts that we're going to see a much stricter approach to asylum. Like they might even bring back that remain in Mexico policy.
Oh.
Remember that one asylum seekers had to wait in Mexico while their cases were being processed in the U.S.?
Yeah, I remember that.
And some people were stuck there for years.
Yeah, it was a long time.
The article is suggesting that we could see something like that again, but potentially even more restrictive.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big deal. Imagine the impact on people who are fleeing violence or persecution. They're already facing so much uncertainty with their asylum case. And then on top of that, they have to deal with the challenges of living in a foreign country potentially for a really long time. It makes things like access to legal aid support networks, even basic necessities, incredibly difficult.
And the article also suggests that it might even become tougher to win asylum cases. Like the process might actually be sped up.
Really?
But it would be to prioritize work permit applications.
Well,
so it's almost like they're saying, show us you can contribute economically first, and then maybe we'll think about, your need for protection.
Interesting. So it's like a shift in priorities. And on that note, the article also mentions that they might bring back those policies that limit work permits to just 2 years instead of 5.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine trying to build a stable life,
Yeah.
put down roots, or even, get a loan when you have no idea if you'll even be allowed to stay in the country after 2 years?
Yeah, that would be incredibly difficult. So what you're saying is that people who came to the U.S. without permission might have an even harder time getting work authorization.
It definitely seems that way.
Yeah.
The article paints a pretty tough picture for them. It really raises some important questions about what happens to those folks who are already here contributing to society, but who don't have a clear legal pathway. If those avenues become even more restricted, we can see a much larger shadow population living with the constant fear of deportation.
Okay, so asylum and work permits could look very different under a second Trump presidency. Let's
Yeah.
talk about family-based green cards now.
Right.
What does the article say about that?
Well, get ready, because it predicts that things could get a lot more complicated for families trying to reunite in the U.S. We're talking increased scrutiny, more documentation, and higher costs. And they even mentioned the possibility of bringing back that I-944 form.
Wait, the I-944 form? What was that again?
Don't you remember that? It was only used for a short time a few years ago, but it basically required a ton of personal information from applicants, like even financial records. It was really controversial because it felt like a huge invasion of privacy.
Oh, yeah, I remember now. Imagine having to hand over your entire financial history just to bring your family to the U.S.
Exactly. It's a big ask. Yeah. And the article highlights how these kinds of changes would disproportionately impact immigrant families that are already struggling financially. It basically creates a system that favors those with more resources, making it even harder for families to reunite.
So it's like yet another barrier.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got potential changes to asylum work permits and family-based green cards. But wait, there's more. The article also warns about potential delays in processing times for all sorts of applications, like green cards, visas, work permits, you name it.
Oh, no.
And it's not just about normal backlogs or anything. It suggests that these delays could happen because of leadership changes at the agencies and maybe even shifts in agency culture.
So like even routine applications that were pretty straightforward before could suddenly require interviews. Or, they might start asking for a ton of extra documentation.
Exactly. It paints a picture of a system that's kind of designed to trip people up at every turn.
Yeah, and I can't even imagine how frustrating and discouraging that would be. You've done everything right,
Yeah.
filled out all the forms,
Yeah.
paid all the fees, dotted all your I's and crossed all your T's, and then suddenly you're hit with all these extra hurdles.
Yeah.
It's like you're stuck in limbo not knowing what's going to happen next.
And it's not just about individual frustration either. These kinds of delays can have ripple effects. Businesses can't fill positions, families are separated for longer, and it can even impact the overall economy.
Right. It's a much bigger problem than just inconvenience for individuals.
Okay, so we've talked about asylum work permits, family-based green cards, and potential processing delays. But this article covers even more ground.
Oh, wow. We're just getting started then.
Yeah, we're just getting started. There's a lot more to unpack. So stay tuned for the next part of our deep dive, where we'll explore even more potential changes to U.S. immigration policy under a second Trump presidency.
Right, so we've covered some of the potential changes that the article outlines, but now I think it's time to shift gears a bit.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, before we jump into strategies and resources, I think it's important to remember that we're not just talking about policies and regulations here.
Yeah.
We're talking about real people's lives, families with hopes and dreams and worries.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in all the details, but ultimately, these potential changes could have a very real impact on people.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the resources and the support systems that are out there is so important. Knowing where to turn for help can make a huge difference for individuals and families that are facing these kinds of challenges.
Okay, so let's get practical. What are some concrete steps that people can take to, try to navigate these potential changes?
Well, first and foremost, knowledge is power. Staying informed about the policy changes, knowing your rights, and understanding what's happening is absolutely crucial.
Okay, but how do people even do that?
Well, luckily, there are a lot of great organizations out there that provide really helpful resources and guidance, like the American Immigration Lawyers Association, or AIL for short, and the National Immigration Forum. They have tons of information available.
Okay, so those are good places to start. What kind of information do they offer?
Well, they can give you updates on, any legal challenges that are happening, and they break down these complicated policies in a way that's easy to understand. And they can even help you find qualified legal representation if you need it.
Okay, so speaking of legal representation, how important is it to have an immigration lawyer, especially if these, predictions come to pass?
I would say that having an immigration lawyer on your side is probably more important now than ever before. Immigration law is incredibly complex, and trying to navigate these potential changes without expert guidance could be really tough. A good lawyer can help you understand your options, build a strong case, and really fight for your right.
So it sounds like having that legal support could make all the difference.
It really could, and it's important not to wait until the last minute to find a lawyer. Proactive planning is key, especially if you see potential challenges coming down the road.
Okay, so staying informed and seeking legal counsel, those are some key steps that people can take on an individual level. But what about the bigger picture? What can we do collectively to push for a more just and equitable immigration system?
That's where the power of collective action comes in. Supporting organizations that advocate for immigrant rights, reaching out to your elected officials, and getting involved in community organizing can really make a difference.
So it's not just about what individuals can do, it's also about using our voices and our collective power to push for change at a systemic level.
Exactly. There are so many amazing organizations out there that are doing incredible work on the front lines, like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the National Immigration Law Center. They're fighting for immigrant rights, day in and day out.
Yeah.
And supporting their work, whether it's through donations, volunteering, or even just spreading awareness, can really have an impact.
And what about contacting our elected officials? Does that actually make a difference?
Yeah, it absolutely does. Lawmakers pay attention to the issues that their constituents care about. Writing letters, making phone calls, attending town hall meetings, all of that sends a strong message that you support humane and just immigration policies.
So it's about making sure that our voices are heard and that those in power know that we're paying attention and holding them accountable.
Yes. And don't underestimate the power of community organizing either. Joining forces with like-minded individuals and groups can really amplify your impact. Participating in rallies, protests, voter registration drives, all of that can create some real momentum for change.
So it's about building a movement, a collective force that can push back against these harmful policies and advocate for a more just and welcoming society.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just about politics. This is about standing up for our values, for human dignity, and for a society that embraces diversity and inclusivity.
I love that. And to our listener out there, remember, you're not alone in this. There are resources available, organizations fighting for your rights, and a whole community of people who believe in a more just and equitable future. So don't give up hope. stay informed and get involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even small actions can make a big difference. Every phone call, every letter, every conversation can contribute to building a better future for everyone.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about these potential changes to U.S. immigration policy under a second Trump presidency. And we've also discussed some ways to navigate these changes and advocate for a more just and equitable system.
We've looked at the potential impacts on asylum seekers, folks trying to get work permits, families hoping to reunite, and individuals facing deportation.
It's definitely been a lot to process, and I'm sure our listener has a lot to think about. But before we wrap things up, I want to leave you with one final thought. Okay, so to really wrap our heads around where things might be headed with immigration in the U.S., I think it's important to look back at, where we've been.
Yeah, I agree. The history of U.S. immigration is really fascinating. And it's complex, too. It's full of these stories of hope and opportunity, but also, exclusion, discrimination, exploitation. Understanding that history can really help us make better decisions about the future.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock a bit. What were the earliest forms of immigration to the U.S.?
Well, before European colonists arrived, what we now call the United States was already inhabited by a lot of diverse indigenous populations. But with colonization, obviously, came waves of European immigrants, mainly from England, France, and Spain.
Okay, and as the nation started to take shape, how did immigration policy evolve?
Well, in the early years, there wasn't really a formal immigration system like we have today. The focus was really on attracting settlers and, building this new nation. But even then, you see preferences for certain groups. Like, for example, the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited citizenship to free white persons of good moral character.
Oh, wow. So the idea of excluding certain groups was there from the very beginning?
Yeah, unfortunately.
Uh,
And as we move into the 19th century, immigration from Europe really explodes. Millions of people are fleeing poverty, famine, persecution. But this huge influx also led to a rise in nativism and discrimination, especially against Irish Catholics and Chinese immigrants.
It seems like, every wave of immigration has been met with this backlash of fear and prejudice. It's like a recurring theme throughout U.S. history.
It's a pretty sad pattern. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we see the rise of these explicitly racist immigration policies, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which completely barred Chinese laborers from entering the country.
It's hard to believe that such blatant discrimination was actually, written into law.
It's a dark period in our history for sure.
Yeah.
And it really serves as a reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can be used to justify these kinds of discriminatory policies.
So how did things change as we moved into the 20th century?
Well, the 1920s saw the passage of the National Origins Quota Act, which really limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. This quota system actually stayed in place for decades and had a huge impact on the demographics of the nation.
So it sounds like the goal wasn't just to control the number of immigrants coming in, but also to control their ethnicity and origin.
Exactly. And that selective approach really shaped the cultural and social landscape of the U.S. for generations.
Okay, so when did we start to see a shift away from these overtly discriminatory policies?
I'd say a major turning point came in the 1960s with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. This was a landmark legislation that abolished that old quota system and established a new system based on family reunification and skilled labor.
Wow, that sounds like a really significant shift. What were the effects of this new system?
Well, it led to a much more diverse immigrant population. We see this huge surge in immigration from Asia, Latin America, and Africa, which really changed the face of America.
Okay, so how has immigration policy evolved in more recent decades?
It's been kind of a mixed bag, honestly. On one hand, we've seen some efforts to create pathways to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, like the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA.
Right, DACA offered some protection from deportation for those young people who were brought to the U.S. as children.
Exactly. But on the other hand, we've also seen a pretty big increase in border security measures, stricter enforcement, and this rise in anti-immigrant rhetoric, especially in the last few years.
It feels like we're constantly trying to find that balance between welcoming newcomers and, tighten our borders. It's a tough balancing act that we haven't quite figured out yet.
It's really at the heart of the whole debate. And it's a debate that's been going on for centuries. How do we balance our values with our security concerns?
Yeah.
It's a really complex issue with no easy answers.
And as we look ahead to these potential changes under a second Trump presidency, understanding this historical context is crucial.
Absolutely. History can teach us a lot about the consequences of both inclusion and exclusion. It shows us how fear and prejudice can be weaponized to create really harmful policies, and how embracing diversity can actually make our nation stronger.
Well said. Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into this complex world of U.S. immigration, what are the key takeaways that you want our listener to remember?
Well, I hope they come away from this with a much deeper understanding of the history of U.S. immigration policy. It's a really multifaceted story, and there aren't any simple solutions.
And what else?
I also want them to understand that the decisions we make about immigration have a huge impact, not just on the lives of immigrants, but on the future of our nation as a whole.
I think that's a really powerful message to end on. The future of U.S. immigration is ultimately up to all of us. It's up to each and every one of us to engage in this conversation with knowledge, compassion, and a commitment to building a just and welcoming society for everyone.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and insightful. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going.
If Donald Trump wins the 2024 election, significant changes to US immigration policies are expected with a focus on stricter enforcement, delays in processing, and more barriers for immigrants. One of the first change could involve asylum seekers, with Trump likely reinstating the Remain in Mexico policy. This policy required asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their case were processed, and it may extend beyond Mexico to other countries, making it more difficult for asylum seekers to enter the US. Trump could also push to expedite asylum cases, particularly those seeking work permits. Work permit policies, which were extended from 180 days to 1 year during Trump's first term, might return along with the restriction on work authorization for undocumented immigrants. Family-based green cards are expected to become harder to obtain during Trump's first term. The process became more complex and costly, especially for low-income immigrants. If he is re-elected, he could reinstate the I-944 form, which scrutinizes the financial and personal circumstances of applicants, making the process even more difficult for those with limited resources. Immigration processing times could also increase, with agencies like USCIS, ICE, and CBP adopting stricter procedures. Routine application may require interviews, and additional documentation could be requested more frequently, exacerbating the already long wait time for visas, green cards, and work permits. Trump's previous term saw strict border security measures, and similar policies are expected to continue. The reinstatement of Title 42, which allowed quick expulsions during the pandemic, could return, though it may be applied for other health emergencies. Additionally, programs like the CBP-1 app, which helps immigrants schedule asylum appointments, may be eliminated, making more difficult for immigrants to enter the US legally. Trump America First policy lead to tighter restrictions on work visas like H-1B and H-2B, which could continue further limiting opportunities for skilled foreign workers. Trump has also tried to cancel temporary protected status and humanitarian parole for immigrants from countries in a crisis. With a more favorable Supreme Court, he may succeed in eliminating these programs, leaving many immigrants vulnerable to deportation. One of the most significant changes could be in deportation practices. Trump is expected to eliminate deportation priorities, potentially leading to mass deportations of undocumented immigrants, including those without criminal records. The construction of new detention centers is also being considered, although the scale of mass deportation would be challenging given the large number of undocumented immigrants in the country. In summary, a second Trump presidency would likely lead to stricter immigration policies, including more challenges for asylum seekers, delays in our processing times, tighter visa restriction, and an increased focus on deportation. Immigrants may face a much more difficult environment, requiring them to stay informed and seek legal advice to navigate these changes.